my name's Paul and I'm one of the ministers at Ostian Thurl Anglican, and it's great to be continuing our series today with you as we come to quite a dramatic passage in Exodus 32 and the incident of the golden calf. I've been considering this passage and what comes to mind is the game of golf. Now let me explain. You see, one of my lockdown goals has been to learn to play golf. I know it's not as hipster as baking sourdough or learning to cut hair at home, but golf at least gets me outside. Anyway, as a beginner golfer, one thing you learn very quickly is that although you're going to aim the ball directly down the center of the course, more often than not, your shot starts here and ends up taking a dramatic turn over some trees and out into the forest, never to be seen again. Now, as we come to this passage from Exodus and the incident of the golden calf, it's one of these moments. The people have everything going for them, but they take such a dramatic turn, and I can't emphasize this enough. Their actions in this passage are so despicable, they deserve to be lost, never to be seen again. They're just so far from where they started and where they should be with God. And it causes me to ask, as we should when reading the Bible, am I like this? Do I have the capability to turn away from God and the path that He has presented to me? And furthermore, what do we learn about God? What's His character when we find ourselves drifting away, or even worse, completely turning away? What do we learn about God? Well, let's come back to Exodus now, where we find this unique situation. It's a very different context to the one we're in today, of course, but we're still going to learn something about the character of God. Now, firstly, I want us to be reminded of what's going on in this whole section, and really it's an invitation. God has invited His people into. Firstly, God's invited His people into His presence. The whole book of Exodus has been leading up to this point. God has remembered His promises. He's been merciful to His people who are living in slavery and under oppression in Egypt, and He brings them out of Egypt via the plagues. They cross the Red Sea, they get led into the wilderness, and God's been present with them in fire, in cloud, and despite their grumbling, He provides for them. And then He gives them His wonderful law. He gives them His law to show them how to live as His people, as we saw last week. And now God is preparing a place. God's preparing a tabernacle, a tent, representative of His presence, like a temple, where people can come and offer sacrifices for their sin, but particularly to meet with God. So just before this section that we're looking at today, we find the final instructions for the tabernacle in chapters 25 to 31. Now, there's a lot more detail, of course, we could go into, but in summary, God's wanting to meet with His people, to return to some sense of what it was like in Eden, God dwelling with His people. And part of this invitation is around this word covenant, an agreement between God and His people. It's like a marriage where promises are made. God will dwell with His people and be their God and enable them to be a blessing to the nations, to grow, to have land, to live under His loving rule. The people then, as they live in God's presence, are invited into God's ways. So Moses has just presented Israel with his law. And that's what Nathan helped us to consider last week in chapters 19 to 24. That God's law was there to show them how to live as God's saved people, to love God and to love others. Now, if you think about the golf ball, this is the fairway. This is the good life of blessing under God's loving rule. It's the covenant agreement where the people, we read in chapter 19, verse 8, they responded and said, "We'll do everything the Lord has said." And we also see in this passage the invitation to, thirdly, be part of God's kingdom. In Exodus 19, verse 5 and 6, "Out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom, people living under God's loving rule as king. Priests are representative of God to all the nations. And to be a holy nation themselves, to be set apart for God. In other words, God's special, treasured people. Now, it's no wonder that throughout the Bible, this relationship is compared to a marriage. And so that's the background. For 40 days and for 40 nights, Moses has been meeting with God in order to bring his word of blessing and law to the people. But then we come to chapter 32, where God's people make a choice. This is what God's people choose to do. Well, let's see, in chapter 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, let us make gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." So it seems that Moses has been taking too long up the mountain, and he represents, of course, their connection to God. So now the people are gathered and they think, well, we need another means to meet with God. Well, what are we going to do? Let's make an idol so then we can hear from God. I just want to take a moment to pause. Perhaps you just like to stop and consider this question, or if you're in a group of people watching this, then perhaps you can discuss this. But here's a question. If you were Aaron, now remember Aaron is the spokesperson and brother of Moses, who's down the mountain with the people. What should you have said at this point? When the people say, "Come, let us make gods who will go before us. We don't know where Moses has gone." How would you respond if you were Aaron? Well, I wonder what Aaron should have said. Perhaps just wait. I know Moses has been going up the mountain an awfully long time, but don't you remember the plagues? Remember what God did through that? Remember the Red Sea? Remember his provision in the desert? Or maybe Aaron should have just said, no. But what does Aaron say? We read from verse 2. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they had handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Well, here's what one person said about this passage. It's hard to imagine a worse thing they could have done. It just seems so mind-blowing. God's rescued people out of slavery. They've witnessed his signs and wonders. They've witnessed his provision. They've had Moses before them speaking the very words of God. And what do? They make a calf. And they don't just make one, but they conspire together and take time to melt their gold together to make one. What's going on? Well, remember their background, their local culture, the waters that they're swimming in, Egypt, Canaan. This is actually how they would worship their gods in this culture. They'd build an emblem animal that would be like a mediator between them and the gods, kind of giving them special access. So here's an example from around 1500 BC from the same area. So this bull or calf is like a pedestal that the god would sit on top of, as you see here. And that's why you get this confusing line in verse 5, by Aaron. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there'll be a festival to the Lord." So the word Lord there is not another God, it's God's name, Yahweh. So the people are rejecting the first commandment to not have any other gods, but particularly it's the second commandment not to make an idol, whether that was an idol of an Egyptian god or even making an idol or pedestal for God himself. Either way, it's a despicable act that replaces God, and it replaces Moses as the mediator between them and God. And pretty much, as you follow on the story, every one of the 10 commandments. Because it's not just the making of an idol, it's what happens after. It's their worship. It's stealing gold that could have been used in the temple or the tabernacle. It's having a festival. It's indulging in revelry, which is probably shorthand for sexual immorality at this point. And then they lie to Moses about the whole thing. It's no wonder Moses comes down and smashes the tablets, because the people have broken the commandments. They've broken the covenant. So what about God? God is the covenant maker. But his people have torn up the covenant. It's like they've got married, they've made promises to love and to cherish, and they've made promises to forsake all others. In other words, not to turn their back on their spouse and take up with someone else. But then they've got the marriage certificate, and it's like they've just walked out of the door of the church and immediately torn up the marriage certificate and burnt it. So what's God, the faithful husband, going to do? Well, I invite you to take another pause now and perhaps just consider this question. What could or what should God do at this point? Well, what could God do, or what should he do? Well, he could just start again. Because God's not unrighteously angry. It's not like he's set these impossible commands and tries to catch out anyone who disobeys. God's righteously angry. He's lovingly rescued his people. He's provided for them. He's called them his special possession. He's prepared a fruitful land, ready to bless them and give them laws that will enable them to be a wonderful example of God's love to the other nations and to all the world. And they've spat in his face. They've replaced him. They've replaced Moses. They've decided, well, I know better. Rather than trust the Lord, they've turned to false gods. Rather than trust in his way, they've indulged in their own version of freedom and fun. And it's horrible. Look at verse 9 here. I've seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation. God still remembers his promises, but it's kind of like at Noah's time. I'm going to start again. That's what he could do. And he does punish, but he doesn't destroy. Moses pleads with him. Now, it can appear at this point that Moses is somehow the one who changes God's mind. But as you consider Moses and God, it's a relationship. God's not so distant that he doesn't communicate and interact with his people. And remember, Moses is the mediator, the one who God speaks to and through on behalf of the people. So in this interaction is the outcome that God's character and mercy and forgiveness was always going to be evident. And so we read in verse 14, then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. God could and rightfully does punish, but he knows the frailty and weakness of the human heart. He desires so much to be with his people because they're his treasured possession. So there needs to be a way forward. And thank goodness there is. As I consider my life and my heart, and there's no way that I have it in me to truly love God without his forgiveness. But what a God we have. We have a God of promise. So what does God promise even in the midst of this terrible scene? Well, God promises to continue to be present with his people. Notice where this passage takes place. We said earlier that leading up to this incident was a number of instructions regarding the tabernacle, the place where God would be especially present with his people. And so in chapters 25 to 31, the tabernacle instructions were described. But then later on, from verse 35 to the end of the book, in chapter 40, is the actual establishment of the tabernacle. So it's always God's plan, as we see here, to fulfill his promises and to be with his people as representative. But in between, however, is this real threat to this relationship in the chapters that we read, in chapters 32 to 34, where God's people turn away from him. It's the threat. But how's this threat dealt with? Well, Moses initially offers himself up. Read these words in chapters 32 and verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They've made themselves gods of gold. But now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses is essentially offering himself in the place of the people, an offering of atonement. But this offer is quickly rejected by the Lord, and we'll come back to this later. What God's people do need at this point is to ask for God's mercy and forgiveness. There's no way back but for the mercy of God. And this is what Moses brings to the Lord in chapter 33. He says in verse 13, "If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so that I may know you and continue to find favor in you. Remember that this nation is your people." It's a reminder that God has brought his people out of Egypt because of his mercy, so that they may know him and that they may live for him. And as Moses meets with the Lord, we have this wonderful promise in verse 14. The Lord replies, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." And it's confirmed in this amazing scene where the glory of the Lord passes by Moses. And we'll uncover much more about the tabernacle as we continue our series and conclude our series on Exodus next week. But where does this leave God's people and where does it leave us? Well, God's people will continue to turn their hearts away from God. They'll continue to be the unfaithful partner in the marriage. But God will keep calling them back. But this pattern won't last forever. Because remember that Moses had offered himself to be an atoning sacrifice for the people's sin, to stand in their place and take the punishment that they deserved? Well, he couldn't, because he had his own sin. But one would come later, much later, and do what Moses couldn't. He would be the perfect mediator where no one else could be. And as New Testament believers, we know, this is what we know about the person of Jesus Christ. Because our hearts are really no different to the people of Israel. We turn away from God. Our hearts run after other gods and worship other things and stray from the path and forget the promises of God and don't trust in his goodness. But we have one who has stood in our place. And Jesus takes it all the way to the cross as our substitute, as our atoning sacrifice. But he rises again to conquer sin and death once for all. Paul writes in Romans chapter 3, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith." Friends, some of you today may know that you're far from God. Some listeners may be feeling this acutely today. But also if you know that there's a sin in your own life and something you just can't shake, come to Jesus. Don't be like the people or like Aaron who just make excuses, but come to God's mercy. Don't play down your failures. Just come clean. But know that this is actually all of us. Me, you, all of humanity. And know that the Lord is gracious and compassionate. And in the cross of Jesus, we have one who stands in our place. As we close today, here are two challenges for us. Firstly, offer yourself to God. And what this means is to sit under his rule, to listen to his word, to confess your sin, and live the right way in his blessing. Consider these words in Romans chapter 12. "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Make a new start today. Offer yourself to God to sit under his loving rule and presence. But secondly, offer Jesus to the world. This is not just a message of individual forgiveness for us. This is a message for humanity. Because all of humanity has taken a right turn off into the trees. Now we're told at the moment to get everything back to normal, the answer is the vaccine, ending lockdown. Well, those things are great. That's a great start. But it won't solve humanity's greatest problem. You see, we need Jesus. Our hope is in him. Offer yourself to our loving and compassionate and kind God. And offer this message of hope. Offer this message of Jesus to the world. Our hope is in him. Let me close with a picture of what peace with God is like and what dwelling in the presence of God is like. The great picture of Revelation 21. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." Amen.